Salve, miei amici. Today we're going to talk about poetry. And today I really do mean poetry. We're not going to talk about a poet, we're going to actually talk about what poetry is. Specifically, we're going to talk about English poetry. Now that might seem a little weird to you. You might be wondering, why are we going to talk about English poetry if we're going to be learning Latin poetry? And really, I do this for two reasons. One, I think it's much easier to talk about Latin poetry once we have an idea of what poetry actually means in our own language. We can then compare the two and make connections and whatnot. And the other thing, too, is I just often feel like students walk in here without knowing what poetry is at all, or with a very rough idea of what poetry is. And so I want you to be able to walk away from this and know what poetry is in your own language and like what makes it so special, what makes it so cool, if you will, depending on how you want to look at it. So when I ask people what poetry is, oftentimes what people will tell me is, oh, it's stuff that rhymes, sentences that rhyme or stanzas that rhyme, things of that nature. However, rhyme is not really the heart of what poetry is. In fact, you can and often do have great poetry that is beautiful and flowing and rhythmical that has no rhyme in it at all. Rhyme is a cool feature that a lot of people like to use, but not necessary. What you do need in poetry is something called meter. Meter is the core of what makes poetry poetry. It is the rhythm or the cadence that the poem follows. So a meter specifically is a cadence or a rhythm that is created by the words that you have arranged in your poem. The word order itself and the words that you've chosen create the rhythm. You don't need anything else to add a rhythm to it. You can put in like musical instruments in the background or anything like that to really bring the rhythm out, to make the rhythm pop, but you don't need it. There's rhythm in just the words on their own. And in English, how we do this is we do it with something called stress. English meter is based on something called stress. And for this reason, it's known as a qualitative meter. Qualitative coming from the word quality because it has to do with the quality of the sound you're producing at any given point. So what is stress? Stress is something that almost all words have in English. Stress is when you take a syllable in a word and you say it either more loudly or in a different pitch or for a different amount of time with a different amount of intensity, anything of that nature to make that syllable stand out or pop in your language. I mean, you can find examples of this in any word, really. So if we want to say, for example, explore, the stress in explore is on the plure part of explore. We know that because we can like draw it out and like really pinpoint it. We can, if we really exaggerate the syllables and we put the stress on the X, it becomes explore. And that sounds kind of weird, but if we say explore, that sounds more natural, more normal if we put that emphasis on the plure, because that's where we do always. Another example would be the word happiness. The stress in happiness falls on the hap part of happiness. If we exaggerate it, we get happiness. If we move that around, it's going to start to sound really weird. We could say happiness or happiness. Well, it's to sound a little bit more awkward than saying happiness. So stress falls on that first part of the word. There are technically like rules and guidelines to how to predict where stress is going to fall in an English word, but there are so many exceptions and it is so complicated that typically what I just tell people is if you can speak English fluently, if you're a native English speaker especially, just try emphasizing different parts of the word and you can pin it down and sort of nail down where the stress falls there. The reason why we have stress in English is because what our language does is it never puts more than one stress in a word. Every word has one stress in it to make it stand out. And we do this so that we can tell our words apart from one another. You may have you ever sat down and like thought about how when we talk, we don't use spaces in between our words. We don't always pause in between them. Sometimes we do. If I want to like be really emphatic about something, I might say, I am tired. And I've put pauses between all my words as if there are actual spaces on them on a piece of paper. But oftentimes when we talk, we don't put pauses between our words. We rely on the stress sound. That's why if you are someone who speaks English very well, and I start talking like this really, really quick, and it's very hard to follow or very hard to discern exactly where I'm putting spaces between my words, you can still understand exactly what I'm saying because you are listening for the stresses and you understand where words start and where words end, because you're listening for one stress for each word. So what does this have to do with poetry? Well, English poets take advantage of this natural stressing that we have to do for all of the words that we say to create a rhythm. When a poem has meter in English, this simply means that we are taking stressed and unstressed syllables and we are arranging them in such a way to create a flow, to create a rhythm throughout the line or throughout the entire poem. So poets are able to treat different words in the English language as if they're different tools in a toolbox to create this meter. For example, one-syllable words can sometimes be used to create stress or to create an unstressed syllable. One-syllable words that are packed with meaning or very significant words or nouns or verbs typically are going to have a stress every time. These are words like cat, dog, house, sit, run, dance. These are all words that are one syllable, but they're pretty important words. They're words that are loaded with meaning and context, and so they are stressed whenever we say them, or almost always when we say them. On the other hand, there are some short words that are basically mini function words that we don't typically stress when we speak. These are words like the, an, in, on, to, all those really short kind of function words that if we were to cut them out of the sentence, we could still get an idea of what the sentence is about. Those are words that are not oftentimes stressed in poetry. Once you get beyond that into multi-syllable words, the rules get more, I'd say probably more precise. So in any word that is more than one syllable, like we saw with happiness and beautiful, there's only one stress in the word, one major stress in the word. We saw in happiness it was the hap, in beautiful it was the beaut. And so these are the stressed syllables while everything else will be unstressed. Sometimes a poet might count a second syllable in the word as a secondary stress to better fit a certain rhythm or a meter that they're going for. And this does exist to a degree. There's a secondary stress in the words that we say, but it's not going to be nearly as pronounced as the major stress. For example, in beautiful, we would say that the stress falls on beaut, but we would also say that there's a secondary stress on full, if you really wanted to break it down. Now, because of these rules of stress, we find that in English, we often actually speak with a natural rhythm of going between unstressed and stressed syllables, right back and forth. Because when you think about it, especially if you're speaking with primarily short words, like one-syllable words, you're using a lot of those short meaning words that are going to have that one stress, and you're using a lot of short function words like the, and, to, and so on. So you're going to naturally alternate between stressed and unstressed. A good example of this would be something like, I'll have a Coke and fries. I'll have a Coke and fries. We've got our pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables. Poets noticed this very early, whether probably not explicitly, but they got a feel for this very early. And as a result, one of the most popular meters that we have in the English language is called iambic meter. Iambic meter is any meter that consists of unstressed and stressed syllables just alternating back and forth, because an iamb is a pattern where you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So let's look at some examples of this from my main man, Shakespeare. So we've got from Romeo and Juliet, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. We have there 2 lines of iambic pentameter. That's 5 iambs in a row, or basically 10 syllables going back and forth between unstressed and stressed syllables. And you can see how those unstressed syllables are either the unstressed part of a multi-syllable word, or they're those short function words like but, what, through, it, the, and so on. Another example, this one from Hamlet, is, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. So here we've got the same situation going on. Note how flexible some of these short words can be. To actually has a stress once, followed by another to that is unstressed. It's the exact same word, just with sort of a different level of emphasis put on it. Poetry is a very flexible thing in English. It's flexible in all languages to a degree. And so for that reason, poets can play around with things. A word doesn't have to be stressed all the time or unstressed all the time. There's wiggle room within the form, so to speak, or freedom within form. Now, there's one last thing I want to add while we're talking about Shakespeare, and that is talking about the meter that he uses, this iambic pentameter. One of the things that I think a lot of students walk away from an English class sort of thinking, and I don't necessarily think it's the best thing to think, is that Shakespeare is so impressive because he wrote in iambic pentameter, like because so much of his plays were composed in this meter. It must have been so difficult to create, and that's what makes him awesome. Don't get me wrong. It is very awesome that Shakespeare did compose so much of his plays in iambic pentameter, and even though it lends itself to the English language, it is definitely a challenging thing to do for an extended period of time or for the many lines that Shakespeare had to do it for. But this is not necessarily where Shakespeare really stands out. In fact, there were other people writing plays living at the same time as Shakespeare who did the exact same thing. So it's important to keep in mind that while this is a really cool thing that Shakespeare did and a really exciting thing that Shakespeare did, it's not the heart of what makes Shakespeare so special. So when you're reading Shakespeare, try not to get caught up in the meter and thinking about the meter, and think about other things as you're reading. Think about his word choice and the way he positions things. And one other really cool thing is think about how he breaks the meter or plays with the meter. So sometimes Shakespeare in his writing will deviate from the iambic pentameter for one line or two lines to really make those lines stand out. My favorite example of this is one of the most famous lines by Shakespeare, if not the most famous line by Shakespeare. And that is, of course, from Hamlet, where Hamlet begins his famous speech by saying, "To be or not to be, that is the question." That might sound like a normal Shakespearean line, but if you just count the syllables, you'll realize that it sticks out because it is not 10 syllables. It's not 5 alternating feet of iambs. There's an extra syllable jammed in there. And for that reason, the line feels a little bit weightier and it turns your attention to the line a little bit more. And those are some of the cool things that Shakespeare does that I think really set him apart and are really worth exploring when you're reading Shakespeare. So keep your eye out for stuff like that. If you read a line of Shakespeare and it leaps out at you, it sounds like just something about it drew your attention to it, count the syllables. Look at the way the syllables are structured. Maybe it's not a line of iambic pentameter. Maybe it's standing out as something unique, and that is what is making it pop for you. So for most of this video, we've talked about meter and stress and how you can use that together to create a rhythm for any poem you're writing or anything of that nature. But what we didn't talk about outside of from the very opening is rhyme. Rhyme is something you can add into poetry to make it more emphatic, to help create that rhythm, to help it stand out on your ears more, make the end of the line stand out to the reader in English. But it's not necessary in poetry. And I wanted to talk about it briefly because since we'll be reading Latin poetry, it's worth mentioning how unimportant rhyme is for Latin poetry. What makes rhyme so special in English is that it's unusual. When we hear two words that sound the same and have the same endings, that sticks out to us. That's not a normal thing. When we speak, for the most part, our words all typically end differently as we're talking, and it's unusual that you say something where two words go together. In Latin, this is not the case. Rhyming is something that naturally happens in the language frequently, and for that reason, it does not stand out to the Romans. The Romans don't find it particularly exciting at all when two words rhyme with each other. So in classical poetry, at least, rhyme is very rare. At least deliberate rhyme is very rare. And this makes sense when you think about it. If you want to say something like the small house in Latin, you just say domus parvus. That's the default way to say it. Those two words rhyme with each other by default. If we want to say the great man in the accusative case in Latin, we say virum magnum. Once again, those words rhyme with each other by default. Even if we want to say like some verbs, like she's dancing and singing, we would say saltat et cantat. Once again, they rhyme with each other. So words rhyme with each other all the time in Latin. And for that reason, the Romans typically avoid rhyme. Sometimes they use it, but it's very uncommon. I will say this, you'll see rhyme sometimes, or maybe frequently even, if you read Latin from the Middle Ages onward, because by then, Latin poets are being influenced by their primary language or the language that's the languages that are around them at the time. And rhyme is becoming more popular in those languages as languages are starting to move away from using so many endings as Latin uses for all of its words. So if we do see rhyme, it'll typically be in medieval poetry, but not so much in the poetry of the classical world. And that's all I have to say about English poetry for now. If you want to learn more about English poetry, I recommend you ask your English teachers, especially if you are exploring a poetry unit. Ask them how the structure is laid out in poems and whatnot, and I'm sure they can shed all sorts of wonderful insights or share all sorts of wonderful insights with you. But as for me, I'll be focusing on teaching you guys Latin poetry. So our next video or our next class where we talk about this, we'll break down what makes Latin poetry so different from English poetry and how it's similar and the kind of rules that it plays by, because it's going to play by rules that are similar to the English rules, but there's a twist to it, as there often is for Latin. And I think that you will appreciate the twist because in Latin poetry, it is much easier to predict and identify the structure of a poem, whereas in English poetry, we have to kind of sit there and really exaggerate words, see where the stress falls, and it's an imperfect way of measuring stress in the first place. In Latin poetry, you'll see it's a lot more regular. Walete.